100 years ago, the man who has most marked Western Europe this century was born. Nondescript, a face from the crowd, he is responsible for the deaths of countless millions worldwide and for the extermination of 6 million Jews. And yet he could play happily with animals and children and even worry about the most humane way to cook lobsters.
I must say, he was a very friendly, polite, and charming man in his private way. And it's hard to believe, but it's true.
Well, I believed that Hitler was a Superman, something like a second god. And I couldn't understand anyone who couldn't see that. Who is immediately responsible for the murder of my parents? One man, Hitler. It would not have happened without him. So it came from that mind that sprang the decision to murder my parents together with the many, many nameless millions who disappeared in the gas chambers of the extermination camps.
He's left us Germans with an undigestible part of our lives and of the life and the third and fourth generation, which may be forgotten, can hardly be forgiven, and is still not understood.
Berlin Sports Palace, destroyed by war, was the scene of Hitler's triumphs of persuasion.
Uplifted by it. You felt like marching. And with it, of course, you felt like marching into other countries too. That thought came too, yes, to show them here, we can sing these songs and there's greatness in it. I know now it's all foolish, but these psychological feelings one got with singing these songs and thinking about what they meant.
How did a civilized nation become enthralled by this man? The most difficult task for today's Germans is to try and understand how their parents fell under this enchantment. To admit the power of Hitler's appeal still causes pain.
Weil wir Deutschen uns klar werden wollen über das Verständnis unserer Geschichte und über Lehren für die politische Gestaltung unserer Gegenwart und Zukunft. Die Opfer, bitte lassen Sie diese würdige Stunde in dieser Form ablaufen. Ich bitte Sie um Verständnis dafür, dass ich Sie herzlich bitte, jetzt sich ruhig zu verhalten.
The outrage, which greeted an attempt by the Bundestag president to explain the dangerous lure of the Nazis, cost him his job. By describing German tolerance for Hitler's crimes against the Jews, he was mistakenly thought to share it.
It gave one the creeps while listening to it, and it doesn't necessarily if you read the speech. Feelings bordering to hysteria were unleashed, and he had to retire. Which just shows you that after 40, 50 years, these things are terribly alive.
Verständlicherweise fühlen sich natürlich viele Juden in aller Welt durch diese Rede angesprochen. Sie haben davon gehört, manche zunächst einmal mit Entsetzen und haben befürchtet, dass es in Deutschland wieder Antisemitismus gibt und dass da jemand, ein Politiker, so haben viele gemeint, war die Nazis rechtfertigen, Hitler rechtfertigen würde. Ich habe genau das Gegenteil getan.
The danger of Hitler was his seductive modernity. His propaganda could present a totalitarian message with the flair of democratic persuasion. The first politician to take to the air, he was also a political tactician who could trade his command of the crowds for real political power.
Gewoge von Menschen. Der Gau Berlin hat an 10 öffentlichen Plätzen große Riesenlautsprecher aufgestellt. Und vor diesen Lautsprechern nun ballen sich die Menschenmauern zusammen, um Zuhörer zu sein der großen Rede, die unser...
Once he got control of the airwaves, he could reach an audience of 20 million. They too could share in his climactic rallies, which modern media organizers now regard with awe.
Watching Hitler being brought in through the crowd was quite interesting, because we're only just now beginning in political and commercial terms to use the same kind of presentational techniques that Hitler was using 40 and 50 years ago. Quite legitimate techniques. Exactly the mood of his audience, which means he studied it very carefully. He's actually obeying the basic principles of public speaking, of knowing your audience, knowing what they're looking for, knowing what you want them to do. But now, all this time I've been talking, he hasn't said a word.
Am 30. Januar dieses Jahres wurde die neue Regierung der nationalen Konzentration gebildet.
You can see time and again, standing still, quiet, and then when he decides to build up the emotional bit later on in the speech, you can actually feel him doing it deliberately.
Zu einem Kampfziel erhoben. Damals gelobte ich mir zum ersten Mal, als unbekannter Einzelner diesen Krieg zu beginnen und mich zu ruhen, bis endlich diese Erscheinung aus dem deutschen Leben beseitigt sein würde.
Members of the audience, particularly women, were brought to a state of frenzy which in some ways resembled an orgasm. And I could see how these people forgot all about their dignity, their status and so forth, and began to loosen up and to scream and shout and to take notice of each other and the animal contact and so forth.
Yes, it was like that, because in a big hall and a speech being made, you cannot always quite follow it. And there were occasions where one, Heil, 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 and everyone shouted, and you shouted Tore, and then you said to your next door neighbor, now what did he say? But you shouted it first.
Und die Arbeitslosenarmee beginnt nun zu wachsen. 1, 2, 3 Millionen, 4 Millionen, 5 Millionen, 6 Millionen, 7 Millionen. Heute mögen es 7 bis 8 Millionen tatsächlich sein. So sieht es heute in Deutschland aus, unter dem Regiment dieser Parteien, die 14 Jahre lang unser Volk ruinierten. Und es ist nun die Frage, wie lange noch?
And my father said to me, as he always did, there's a chair, sit down, keep your mouth shut and your ears open, learn something. And they read the text, and Hitler had a pencil in his hand and said, this was good, play that up. This didn't go so well, you can cut that. And Goebbels made 1 or 2 suggestions, and I was astonished that the man who had less than half an hour before been in a frenzy of emotion himself and whipped up the audience to absolute hysteria should be capable of sitting there and coolly assessing his own speech from a point of view of the propagandistic effectiveness.
He also offered ritual, the thrill of immersion in a vast pagan rite which still had the familiar overtones of religious practice, well remembered by the former Catholic choir boy from Lambach. At the age of 6, Hitler had joined the choir of this Benedictine monastery. He later wrote, "I had excellent opportunity to intoxicate myself with the solemn splendor of the brilliant church festivals."
I am inclined to think that these early experiences as a choir boy exposed to the ritual had a very powerful impact. You might say he took over elements and then kind of homespun his own religion.
Hitler offered himself as a new messiah, and the Germans embraced this dubious salvation.
In some kindergartens, they had the prayer for the little children of 3 or 4 years. Händchen falten, Köpfchen senken und an Adolf Hitler denken. Now translated. You can't. It is so ridiculous, but it's trist. We laugh, but that is what dangerous is.
What then are the clues to this man's inflated vision of himself? His parents lived in the Austrian border town of Braunau am Inn, where his authoritarian father was a customs official. Hitler's mother, Clara, was her husband's niece and servant before she married him. She bore 3 children, all of whom died within a month of each other. Then, on the 20th of April, 1889, she bore a child who was to survive. She called him Adolf.
So Adolf became, as I see it, very important to her. And she formed a very, very close tie. And I think this is one source of this enormous sense of importance, even of maybe having a mission and of being free and destined to do anything he wanted, which I think is one of the major characteristics of Adolf.
Although Hitler had dreams of becoming an artist, he neglected to do any work at school. He devoted himself instead to a fantasy world founded on the music and romantic ideals of Wagner, in which he rebuilt on a grandiose scale Linz, the city where he had failed so badly. It was to be a theme to which he returned again and again whenever reality threatened to crush his fantasies. His lofty hopes of entering the art academy were to be destroyed. His mother's death removed the one person who had believed in him. He fled reality yet further when his drawings failed to secure him a place at the academy. Pretending to be a student, he drifted hopelessly before finding sanctuary among the dossers of this Viennese men's home. He later claimed that in Vienna he formed the granite foundation of his worldview. Among the vagrants, he developed his lasting obsession with race. The Germans, as the master race of Central Europe, he felt, were threatened by the influx of inferior races, the Slavs and especially the Jews. All human life, he thought, was struggle and war. And when war broke out in 1914, he was in Munich to welcome it. An ecstatic face in the crowd. He enrolled at once in the German army. War suited him. For the first time, he belonged. He was wounded and won an Iron Cross, but remained a corporal. His officers could find no leadership potential in him. He was still a face in the crowd. In the last summer of the war, he was caught in a British gas attack and temporarily blinded. He recovered in hospital as Germany abruptly collapsed before her territory was even invaded. In 1918, the German people suffered a defeat they had never believed possible and an attempted revolution by the left, which caused bitter division. The new republic had to struggle with the loss of territory and the reparations imposed by the Allies at Versailles. There was runaway inflation and the constant threat of civil war. These were the years of crisis in which Hitler discovered his extraordinary talent as a speaker, and in 1923 made his first and only attempt at seizing power by force in a coup. It was a hopeless failure for which Hitler received a lenient sentence behind bars. There he held court with his followers and wrote a political testament from which he never departed. Revenge for Versailles, the capture of more living space at the expense of Russia, the creation of a new 1,000-year empire in the East with the native Slavs reduced to the status of slaves and the total exclusion of Jews. His own role in this and the National Socialist Party he now led was clear. He was to be number one in a party on the political margins. But then the slump of 1929, which lost millions their jobs, gave Hitler a second chance as the demagogue who could blame it all on the guilty men of 1918.
Alles angestiftet und alles gemacht und alles verantwortet von den Männern des Novembers 1918.
Hitler's Nazis mixed the threat of revolution and the promise of legality. He never achieved a majority, but just when his vote was falling, the old German elite borrowed his mass movement for their own ends. Hitler was to be chancellor in a coalition government appointed by the aged President Hindenburg. We've hired him, they said, as Hitler came soberly to office, but he was using them.
I was 10 years old when he came to power, and much of Hitler's speaking was about that. Das Diktat from Versailles. We got to throw those chains off and free ourselves. And within the diktat from Versailles, putting the chains around us, of course there were the Jews and the Bolsheviks and the plutocrats, and we got to wipe them off Europe and establish our beautiful society, which will be lovely for human beings.
Morgentraining in der Gymnastikschule Medau.
Most Germans abandoned themselves to the dream. The nightmare was to follow.
It was a great feeling. You felt you belonged to something great. You felt you belonged to a great nation which now find its feet again. Germany now was in good, safe hands, and I was going to help and build a strong Germany. A lovely feeling. But my father, of course, thought differently about it.
The new regime struck hard. Empowered by an enabling act, it seized communists, socialists, and trade unionists. Brown-shirted stormtroopers reminded everyone of the dangers of dissent.
From then on, Father said to me, now, Henry, don't say what I am saying here to you, because I always argued with my father. By then I was in the Hitler Youth, and I was very much for the Hitler regime. That was against all his feeling, his background as a conscious working man.
Cleverly exploiting the generation gap, propaganda portrayed the left as thugs.
Was hast du das gelernt, Mann?
Du lass doch den Jungen, ja, da wird es...
Was heißt das so, wenn hier was gesungen wird? Dann singst du... Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten... Warum singst du nicht mit, was? Na los! Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten... Kannst du nicht singen, so? Da werd ich dir beibringen.
Very shortly after Hitler came to power, the press was muzzled. That was censored. So you could read of nothing of what was going on, and therefore all these experiences of the other side, the black side of National Socialism, I think had to come to you personally. Nothing was recorded except enormous headlines of Hitler's progress and prowess.
And there was economic progress. Rearmament, labor service, and public works transformed Germany, helped by an improving world economy. 5 million were put back to work, but trade unions and strikes were outlawed. The dictatorship worked.
Beispielsweise ein Mann, der mir geschrieben hat, ich war viele Jahre arbeitslos und ich hätte, so drückte er sich aus, mit dem Teufel einen Pakt abgeschlossen, wenn ich Arbeit bekommen hätte. Und dann kam Hitler und ich habe Arbeit bekommen und dann bin ich ihm nachgelaufen.
The devil was plain to see. Jews were first boycotted, then harassed. Jewish authors' books were burned in the name of German culture, which was personified by propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels.
Das Zeitalter eines überspitzten jüdischen Intellektualismus ist nun zu Ende.
We knew as schoolboys about Dachau, for instance. We knew about Oranienburg and we knew about Dachau. And there was a ditty which we all repeated, including people who later disclaimed all knowledge of that sort of thing. And the ditty went like this: Lieber Gott, mach mich stumm, dass ich nicht nach Dachau komm, which means, dear God, strike me dumb so that I shan't be sent to Dachau.
My personal feeling about concentration camps, and that of all my schoolmates and my friends in the Hitler Youth, was that anti-Reich elements, they were being put there into those concentration camps, and for the first time in their lives probably, they were made to work for Germany. And these elements, they were, of course, communists and Jews and homosexuals and Bible punchers and thieves and robbers and these sort of people. And I personally felt, right, have them into a concentration camp, make them work. About brutalities and torture or so, I didn't give it any thought, and I never had heard anything.
Hitler held power by a combination of terror and propaganda. At this stage, there was little killing. The camps were filmed as correction centers for the antisocial. Meanwhile, other Germans could relax. Life was good to them.
The successes Hitler had, Germany was actually a wonderful place to be alive, unless you were Jewish, you had strong political convictions, either as a socialist or as a communist, or you believed in individuality and the freedom of the individual. But that never is the majority of any people.
No, there was no resistance movement, and there couldn't be. Nowhere in the world can develop a resistance movement when people feel better from day to day. No, resistance were stones in a torrent. And the water crashed just over us.
Hans Kütemeyer.
Every Nazi ritual was designed to enhance the myth of an unstoppable and glorious movement. The feeble reality of Hitler's 1923 coup was transformed by its elaborate commemoration of supposed martyrs to an eternal, even divine cause.
I think Hitler was compensating for a very deep sense of inferiority by living in a world of fantasy, of grandiose fantasies. And what is so terrifying and so awful is that he was able actually to put those grandiose fantasies into practice so that they no longer seemed mad. I mean, he reminds one so very much of people in mental hospitals who say, oh, I own the banks, I own the world, I'm the most powerful man in the world. But the thing was, he made this come true. And that is what's so horrifying.
Hitler expanded his power with ruthless political skill. He built up the black-shirted SS as the instrument of his terror. He used it to purge its predecessors, the street gangsters of the SA. Heinrich Himmler became the chief executioner. Among the victims were Ernst Röhm, once Hitler's closest colleague, Gregor Strasser, the radical Nazi, and former Chancellor Schleicher. The army and Hitler's right-wing allies were appeased.
Da hat sich mit Blut vollgesaugt und einer Maske umgeben, die ihm sagte, was ist der Mensch, den alle fürchten müssen. Eine teuflische Figur.
Hitler resembled many of the people that we know of as sadistic murderers. People like the Ripper, and people like Dennis Nielsen, all of whom were isolated people. His isolation showed itself in the fact that he couldn't make relationships, and therefore he didn't care about other people at all. They were expendable. And that's very characteristic of sadistic murderers.
Apart from his mother, the one person to whom Hitler does seem to have been close was his niece, Gerli Raubel. She was the daughter of the only member of his family whom he